No one knew why Margaret Holloway burned every photograph that night, but deep down, the whole town knew something was ending. I'm Evelyn Brooks, and tonight I'm holding a letter that's been sitting in a shoebox for 53 years. It smells like old paper and regret. The handwriting is shaky, written by someone who knew they were running out of time. Margaret Holloway, a name that used to mean something in Cedar Falls, Iowa. She was the kind of woman who wore gloves to the grocery store, the kind who never raised her voice, never caused a scene. But on November 14, 1970, Margaret did something that no one in that quiet town could ever explain. She walked into the Cedar Falls Public Library at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, placed a sealed envelope on the circulation desk, looked the young librarian straight in the eye, and said, "Don't open this until someone asks the right question." Then she disappeared. For 32 years, that envelope sat in a drawer, yellowing, forgotten, until a summer afternoon in 2002, when a college student researching local history asked a simple question: did anything strange ever happen in this town? The librarian, now 63 years old, remembered. Her hands trembled as she opened that envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a letter written in Margaret's careful cursive. What she read made her cry for the first time in 20 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started. Back to 1956, when Margaret Holloway was just Margaret Flynn, a 22-year-old schoolteacher with dark curls and a smile that could light up a room. She taught third grade at Hopewell Elementary, and every single one of her students adored her. She had this way of making each child feel like they were the most important person in the world. That's where she met him. Daniel Crane. He was the school janitor, a quiet man with kind eyes and calloused hands. He'd lost his wife to pneumonia 3 years earlier and was raising his 7-year-old daughter, Emily, all by himself. Emily was in Margaret's class. The first time they really spoke was on a Tuesday evening in October. Margaret had stayed late grading papers, and Daniel was mopping the hallway outside her classroom. Emily was sitting on the floor by the supply closet, drawing pictures with broken crayons. "She's talented," Margaret said, kneeling beside the little girl. Daniel looked up, surprised that someone was talking to him. Most people didn't. "She is," he said quietly. "Gets that from her mother." Margaret smiled. "She gets her kindness from her father." That was the beginning. They started talking more. Brief conversations in empty hallways, a shared cup of coffee in the teacher's lounge after everyone else had gone home. Daniel would tell her about Emily's latest adventure, and Margaret would laugh in a way that made him feel like maybe life wasn't just about surviving anymore. By December, people were starting to notice. In a town like Cedar Falls, people always noticed. The principal, Mr. Harwick, called Margaret into his office one afternoon. He didn't sit down. Neither did she. "Miss Flynn," he said, his voice tight, "there have been concerns about your relationship with the custodial staff." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "Daniel Crane is a good man." "I'm sure he is," Mr. Harwick said, adjusting his tie. "But he's also a widower with a child, and you're a young, unmarried teacher. People talk. Let them talk." Mr. Harwick's face hardened. "I'm not suggesting, Miss Flynn. I'm telling you. Keep your distance, or I'll have no choice but to reconsider your employment here." That's when everything changed. Margaret could have walked away. She could have followed the rules, kept her job, and lived the quiet, acceptable life everyone expected from her. But she didn't, because 3 weeks later, on New Year's Eve 1956, Daniel Crane asked her to marry him in the school parking lot under a sky full of stars, and Margaret Flynn said yes without hesitation. They were married in February, a small ceremony at the courthouse, with only Emily as their witness. Emily wore a yellow dress and held a bouquet of daisies. Margaret wore her mother's pearls. Daniel wore the only suit he owned. The town turned on them immediately. Mr. Harwick fired Margaret the next morning, said it was a budget issue, but everyone knew the truth. Daniel was told he could keep his job, but only if he worked the night shift, alone, out of sight. The other teachers stopped speaking to Margaret when they saw her at the market. The neighbors stopped waving. Even the pastor at their church suggested they might be more comfortable attending services in the next town over. But Margaret didn't break. She held her head high. She got a job at the diner on Route 9, serving coffee and pie to truck drivers and travelers who didn't know her story and didn't care. Daniel worked his night shifts, and during the day, he took care of Emily and helped Margaret around their small house on Maple Street. They were happy. Against everything, they were happy. Wait, don't miss this detail. Emily grew up surrounded by love. She excelled in school, won a scholarship to the University of Iowa, and became a nurse. In 1968, she married a young man named Thomas Way, the son of Chinese immigrants who ran a restaurant in Iowa City. They had a beautiful wedding, and Margaret cried tears of joy as she watched her stepdaughter walk down the aisle. But then 1970 came, and with it came the war, and the fear, and the anger that was tearing America apart. Thomas was drafted. Emily was pregnant with their first child, and Margaret watched history repeat itself as people who smiled to her face whispered behind her back about her daughter marrying one of them, and her son-in-law going off to fight in that war. On September 3, 1970, Thomas Way was killed in action in Quang Tri Province. He was 24 years old. He never met his son. Emily came home to Cedar Falls to bury her husband. The funeral was small. Barely anyone came. Margaret stood beside her daughter, holding her hand as they lowered Thomas into the ground, and she felt something inside her finally crack, because she realized that nothing had changed. Not really. The town that had judged her for loving a janitor was the same town that whispered about Emily for loving a Chinese-American man. The world that had tried to punish Margaret for choosing happiness over propriety was the same world that had taken Emily's husband and left her alone with a newborn baby and a grief too big to carry. That's when the most shocking part began. Margaret started collecting stories, not just her own, but everyone's. She started writing letters to people who'd been forgotten, overlooked, judged. The widow who'd lost her farm because the bank wouldn't give a loan to a woman, the black family who'd been run out of town in 1948, the teenage girl who'd been sent away because she got pregnant and no one asked about the boy responsible, the veteran who came home from Korea with nightmares no one wanted to hear about. She wrote hundreds of letters, and she saved every response. She kept them in a wooden box under her bed. Stories of pain and resilience, stories of people who'd been broken by judgment and cruelty and indifference, stories that no one wanted to remember, because remembering meant admitting that Cedar Falls wasn't the perfect little town everyone pretended it was. Daniel asked her once why she was doing it. They were sitting at the kitchen table late at night, and Margaret was reading another letter, her eyes red from crying. "Because someone has to remember," she said softly. "Someone has to say their names." But even Daniel didn't know the whole truth. Not yet, because Margaret had a plan, and it was dangerous, and she knew that if she told anyone, even him, they'd try to stop her. The letters kept coming. Margaret received them from all over Iowa, and eventually, from across the Midwest. Word spread quietly among certain communities, people who'd been hurt, displaced, forgotten. They heard about the schoolteacher in Cedar Falls who listened, who wrote back, who kept their stories safe. There was Helen Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who'd worked in the meatpacking plant for 30 years and been paid half what the men earned for the same work. There was James Crawford, a black veteran who'd served in World War II and came home to find that the GI Bill benefits that helped white soldiers buy houses somehow never seemed to apply to him. There was Maria Santos, whose family had been American citizens for 3 generations, but were still told to go back where they came from whenever anyone in town needed someone to blame. Margaret documented all of it. She wrote down dates, names, places. She kept newspaper clippings that contradicted the official stories. She collected photographs that proved people had existed in places they were said never to have been. She was building a case, not for a court of law, She knew that justice system had failed most of these people already. She was building a case for history, for truth, for the future. In late October 1970, Margaret received a letter that changed everything. It was from a man named William Harrison, and it was postmarked from Des Moines. William had been the Cedar Falls sheriff from 1945 to 1963. He was dying of cancer, and he wanted to confess. He told Margaret about the night in 1948 when he'd been ordered by the mayor and the town council to run the Jackson family out of town. He described how they'd surrounded the Jackson house at midnight, how they'd threatened to burn it down if the family didn't leave by sunrise. He explained that Robert Jackson's only crime had been registering to vote and encouraging other black families in the area to do the same. William Harrison wrote that he'd been ashamed every day since, that he'd quit the force in 1963 because he couldn't stand what he'd become, that he was telling Margaret this because someone needed to know the truth before he died. Margaret sat with that letter for 3 days. She didn't eat, barely slept. Daniel found her at the kitchen table on the third morning, the letter spread in front of her, tears on her face. "What is it?" he asked. "Proof," she said quietly. "Proof that they knew. Proof that it was deliberate. Proof that Cedar Falls isn't what it pretends to be." "What are you going to do with it?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to make sure no one can ever say it didn't happen." That's when Daniel understood. His wife wasn't just collecting stories. She was building a monument to every person Cedar Falls had tried to erase. But the most dangerous part was yet to come. Margaret knew that if she tried to publish any of this while she was alive, powerful people would destroy her. They'd sue her for libel. They'd claim she was a bitter woman with an axe to grind. They'd discredit every testimony, every photograph, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. So she made a different choice. She decided to disappear. Not physically. She couldn't leave Emily and her grandson, but she could disappear from the historical record in a way that would protect her work. She could make herself invisible so that her documentation could remain visible. On November 14, 1970, Margaret woke up before dawn. She made coffee. She kissed Daniel while he slept. She walked into Emily's room and watched her daughter and grandson sleeping peacefully, and she whispered, "I love you more than anything in this world." Then she got dressed, put on her gloves, and began the most important day of her life. Her first stop was the Cedar Falls Public Library. She placed the sealed envelope on the circulation desk at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. Inside was her letter, the full documentation of everything she'd collected, the names, the dates, the stories, the proof, and instructions for when it should be opened. Don't open this until someone asks the right question. Margaret knew that question would come eventually. Someone young, someone curious, someone who didn't have a stake in protecting the town's reputation, someone who would ask about the truth instead of accepting the comfortable lies. From the library, Margaret walked to the post office. She'd prepared 27 copies of her documentation, and she mailed them to 27 different locations: university libraries, historical societies, civil rights organizations, newspapers in other states, places where the records would be preserved even if Cedar Falls tried to destroy them. The clerk at the post office, a young man named Peter who'd always been kind to her, noticed the stack of packages. "That's a lot of mail, Mrs. Holloway," he said, smiling. "It's important," Margaret said. "Make sure they all go out today." "Yes, ma'am." He paused, then added, "Are you all right? You look tired." Margaret smiled at him. She was tired, bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I'm all right." "Peter, thank you for asking." It was the last conversation she'd have with anyone in town that day besides Daniel. When she got home, the sun was setting. Daniel was in the kitchen, making dinner. Emily was giving the baby a bath upstairs. Everything looked normal, peaceful, ordinary. Margaret walked into the backyard and started a fire in the old metal drum they used for burning trash. That's when she began destroying her own history. Every photograph she owned went into the flames. Her wedding photos, pictures of Emily as a baby, images of Thomas in his uniform, snapshots of birthday parties and holidays and ordinary moments that proved she'd lived a full life filled with love. Daniel found her there when the smell of smoke drew him outside. He stood frozen, watching the fire consume their memories. "Margaret, what are you doing?" His voice broke on her name. "Making sure they can't take anything else from us," Margaret said. Her face was wet with tears, but her hands were steady as she fed another photograph to the flames. "They've taken our dignity, our daughter's happiness, our son-in-law's life, but they can't take our story, not anymore." "I don't understand." Margaret turned to face him. Behind her, the fire crackled and sparked, turning their past to ash. "The story I've been protecting. It's bigger than us now. It's bigger than this town. And if I leave any personal history behind, they'll use it to discredit everything else. They'll say I was bitter, emotional, unreliable. They'll point to these pictures and say, I was a scorned woman who couldn't let go. But if I erase myself, if I become no one, then the only thing left will be the truth." Even now, Margaret was still holding on. Daniel watched his wife destroy their photographs, and he understood what she was sacrificing. She was erasing their happiness to preserve everyone else's pain. She was making herself invisible so that others could finally be seen. He stepped forward and took the next photograph from her hand. It was a picture of them on their wedding day, young and hopeful and in love. "Together," he said quietly, and placed it in the fire himself. They burned everything. And when the last photograph had turned to ash, Margaret and Daniel stood together in the darkness, holding hands, mourning the evidence of their joy so that the evidence of others' suffering could survive. Inside the house, Emily put the baby to bed, unaware that her mother had just made a choice that would echo through generations. You won't believe what happened next. Life continued. Margaret kept working at the diner. Daniel kept working his night shifts. Emily raised her son, Michael, with the fierce determination of a woman who'd loved and lost too much too young. They were a family surviving in a town that had never truly accepted them. But something had shifted. Margaret moved through the world differently now, lighter somehow, as if the weight she'd carried for so long had finally been lifted. She stopped trying to fit in, stopped caring what the neighbors thought. When people whispered as she walked by, she smiled at them. When former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her, she called out friendly greetings. When the pastor suggested again that they might be happier elsewhere, Margaret politely told him that Cedar Falls was her home, and she had no intention of leaving. She'd erased her image, but reclaimed her presence. The years passed. Michael grew up strong and brilliant, a child who asked too many questions and refused to accept easy answers. Emily told him stories about his father, about the war, about the cost of standing up for what was right. Margaret watched her grandson absorb these lessons, and she saw the future taking shape in his eyes. In 1982, Michael Way left Cedar Falls to attend the University of Iowa. He studied history and political science, driven by questions he couldn't quite articulate. He wrote his senior thesis on the civil rights movement in small Midwestern towns, focusing on places like Cedar Falls that had largely avoided scrutiny because nothing major had happened there. His research uncovered fragments, references to families that had disappeared, employment records that showed suspicious patterns, newspaper articles that mentioned disturbances without providing details. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle when half the pieces had been deliberately destroyed. He called his grandmother and asked her if she knew anything about the Jackson family. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking about them?" Margaret's voice was careful, controlled. "Because they vanished from the historical record in 1948, and no one will tell me why." Another silence. Then, "Come home this weekend. There's something you need to know." That weekend, Margaret told her grandson everything. About the letters she'd collected, the documentation she'd compiled, the envelope she'd left at the library 12 years earlier, about William Harrison's deathbed confession, about the night she'd burned every photograph to protect the truth. Michael sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had read hundreds of letters from forgotten people, and he felt the weight of history settle on his shoulders. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "Because I did tell someone," Margaret said gently. "I told the future. I told whoever would be brave enough to ask the right question. And now I'm telling you. What do you want me to do?" Margaret reached across the table and took her grandson's hand. Hers was thin now, marked with age spots and arthritis, but her grip was strong. "I want you to finish what I started. I want you to ask that question. I want you to open that envelope. And I want you to make sure everyone knows the truth." Michael graduated in 1986 and went to law school. He specialized in civil rights law, taking cases that no one else wanted to touch. He defended people who'd been discriminated against, families who'd been displaced, workers who'd been exploited. He became the lawyer his father never got to be. And in 1989, when Daniel Crane died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71, Michael gave the eulogy. He talked about his grandfather's kindness, his quiet strength, his unwavering love for Margaret, even when the world told him he'd made a mistake by marrying her. "My grandfather," Michael said, "taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day, even when it's hard, even when everyone tells you you're wrong, even when it costs you everything." Margaret sat in the front row of the funeral, holding Emily's hand, and she thought about the young janitor she'd fallen in love with 33 years earlier, the man who'd stood beside her through everything, who'd helped her burn their photographs so the truth could survive, who'd never once asked her to be anyone other than who she was. She lived 9 more years without him, quiet years mostly. She kept working at the diner until she was 80. The owners tried to convince her to retire, but Margaret insisted she liked staying busy. The truth was, she liked listening to people, travelers passing through, truck drivers on long hauls, salesmen taking a break. They all told her their stories, and Margaret remembered everyone. Margaret died in 1998 at the age of 84. Emily and Michael were with her when she passed. Her last words were, "Someone will ask. Someone will find it. Just wait." Just when you thought it was over, here's what happened. 4 years after Margaret's death, in the summer of 2002, a college student named David Zimmerman came to the Cedar Falls Public Library to research his thesis on small-town Iowa history. He was looking for stories that hadn't been told, voices that hadn't been heard. The head librarian had retired, replaced by a younger woman named Anna Kowalski. Yes, Kowalski, the granddaughter of Helen Kowalski, the Polish immigrant who'd written to Margaret about discrimination at the meatpacking plant. David approached the circulation desk and asked, somewhat rhetorically, "Did anything strange ever happen in this town?" Anna Kowalski froze. She'd heard those exact words before. Years ago, when she was a teenager helping her grandmother sort through old papers, Helen had mentioned a teacher who'd asked people to tell their stories, a woman who'd promised that someday someone would ask the right question. "Wait here," Anna said. She went into the back office and opened a drawer that her predecessor had always kept locked. Inside was an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had cracked over the decades. On the front, in careful handwriting, "To be opened when someone asks the right question." She brought it to David Zimmerman, her hands shaking. "I think," she said slowly, "you just asked the right question." They opened it together. Inside was Margaret's letter, 47 pages of careful documentation. Names, dates, testimonies, proof. The story of Cedar Falls as it really was, not as it pretended to be. Also inside was the photograph, 32 third graders from 1956, and in the back row, standing slightly apart from the others, a little girl named Ruthie Jackson. Anna Kowalski read the letter and cried, because her grandmother's name was there. Helen's story, preserved and honored by a woman she'd never met, but who'd cared enough to remember. David Zimmerman read it and felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. This was the story he'd been looking for. This was history that demanded to be told. He published his thesis. It was picked up by the Iowa Historical Society, then by regional newspapers, then by national media. Historians began investigating. The story of Margaret Holloway and her documentation of forgotten voices became the story of how many small American towns had erased their own uncomfortable truths. The Cedar Falls Town Council initially tried to deny everything. They claimed Margaret had been mentally unstable, that her documentation was unreliable. But then Michael Way stepped forward. He'd become a prominent civil rights attorney by then. He held a press conference and presented evidence from the 27 archives where Margaret had sent copies, William Harrison's signed confession, newspaper articles that corroborated the stories, employment records showing systematic discrimination. The town of Cedar Falls had to reckon with its past. In 2004, the town erected a memorial in the Central Park. It listed the names of everyone Margaret had documented. At the top were these words from her letter. "We like to believe that we're good people living in a good town. But goodness isn't what we claim. It's what we do when no one's watching." Emily Way attended the dedication ceremony at 73. When asked to speak, she said, "My mother never wanted to be remembered as a hero. She wanted to be remembered as someone who refused to let others be forgotten." She placed yellow daisies at the memorial base, the same flowers she'd carried at her mother's wedding. That's when everything shifted. 3 weeks later, Anna received a phone call. The voice was elderly, uncertain. "My name is Ruth Jackson Williams. I think you were talking about my family." Ruthie Jackson, the little girl from the photograph. She was alive, 83 years old, living in Chicago. Ruth had left Cedar Falls with her family in 1948, at age 8. They'd moved to Chicago where her father found work and could register to vote without fear. Ruth became a teacher herself, married, raised children. But then her granddaughter showed her an article about Margaret's memorial. Ruth saw her name on the list, saw the photograph, saw the notation. Ruthie Jackson, remembered. Ruth flew to Cedar Falls, first time back in 54 years. Emily Way met her at the airport. Two elderly women, connected by a teacher who'd loved them both, embracing as tears streamed down their faces. They went to the memorial together. Ruth stood there, her hand pressed against her name etched in stone. "She remembered me," Ruth whispered. "All these years, I thought we'd been erased, but she remembered." At sunset, they went to the cemetery. Yellow daisies surrounded Margaret's headstone. Ruth knelt and placed her hand on the stone. "Thank you for not forgetting. And here's the final detail. Last month, I received a package. Inside was a letter dated November 13, 1970, the day before Margaret left the envelope. Addressed, 'To whoever's listening.' Margaret wrote, 'Tomorrow, I will hide all of this. Then I will erase myself. If I tell these stories as myself, as a woman who was fired, whose daughter married the wrong man, people will dismiss me as bitter. But if I remove myself, the stories stand alone. I'm afraid. Afraid no one will ask. Afraid the envelope will be lost. Afraid I'm sacrificing everything for nothing. But I'm more afraid of staying silent. So I'm choosing truth over comfort, other people's voices over my own. If you're reading this," someone asked, "someone cared. Thank you. Remember them. All of them. And if you can, remember me too." Margaret Holloway died, believing she might have sacrificed everything for nothing. She never knew she'd change Cedar Falls, that Ruth would come home, that her grandson would become a civil rights lawyer. She did it all on faith. That's courage. That's what it means to believe truth matters, even when you'll never see justice. Margaret Flynn Holloway existed. She mattered. And her story, along with all the stories she protected, will never be forgotten. This is Evelyn Brooks. I'll carry her voice forward, because that's what we do. We remember, we tell, we refuse to let the silence win. This is Evelyn Brooks. Good night. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.